Hello and welcome to the Marketing Week podcast, brought to you in association with podcast agency 1860. I'm delighted to be joined by Becky Moffat, Chief Customer Officer for Wealth and Personal Banking at HSBC, and she's also UK CMO. So you're a very busy woman, Becky. So thanks for
You're
thanks
very
for
welcome.
joining
Thank you
us.
for having me.
No worries. So as I mentioned there's sort of two roles that you're taking on now at HSBC, and the sort of Chief Customer one was a sort of a newer addition earlier this year. Can you explain a little bit about what that means, I guess, for you and for the organisation, having that sort of changed remit?
Yes, thank you. It's a really fantastic opportunity, actually, to join up lots of dots around customer and what we do for customer. Honestly, it's always been my kind of view that marketing is a very broad church discipline, and you and I've talked about that before. And within it has many specialised and very highly specialist disciplines within it. For me, it's all about intrinsically understanding customers, human behaviour, understanding needs, building solutions, and then communicating how those solutions can actually help customers, and doing that in a way that is good for customers, but also drives really strong commercial outcomes for the business. So good for customers, good for business. So fundamentally, it's a commercial discipline grounded in customers and customer understanding. So for me, the customer role along with the marketing role brings those two things together. And enables me to actually join things up across everything from data and analytics and customer insight right the way through to then what does that tell us about what customers are doing, what they need, what they like and what they dislike about us, how we can then change things, the things that we need to change to make things easier, better and more helpful, what that does to our bottom line in terms of the things that we're doing. So you can actually see all of this much more sort of in a more joined up and rounded way, but then also how we actually communicate some of the things that we have created, developed, that we want to deliver, and that so we can really, really make it clear and simple for customers to understand this is what we offer you, this is why it might be helpful for you, and this is how to actually use it to get the best out of it. So it's a phenomenal opportunity to actually look at things in a more end-to-end way, and to break down a number of silos that you might have had historically, where you might have had data and analytics doing some work in one area, sort of customer insight in another. Actually putting those two things much closer together enables us to get a much more rounded view of what customers say and what customers do. Not always the same thing, but also sort of a big external view, but actually then internally, what are we seeing? What are we learning? How do we actually see those data signals from customers? So the role now enables me to look right the way across and join up some of those dots, and hopefully the theory is that in doing that we can actually deliver better outcomes for customers in a more efficient and effective way, which drives commercial performance for HSBC.
It's brilliant. And do you think so? In my job, I'm always writing about, because I cover specific sort of like work and skills, so any sort of new remits for marketers, or I've written a lot about the growth of Chief Customer Officer, Chief Growth Officer, Chief, all these sort of new but not new roles that are coming into the fore. What you were sort of describing there around how it's working at HSBC, do you think it's particularly important in financial services to have that wider remit, or would you like to see that sort of, is that relevant to any brand?
I think any marketer is really all about customer and growth, and therefore I think you can have that broader remit anywhere. And then what you need to recognise is within marketing as a very broad church, you have these very specialist disciplines. So advertising, for example, is a really skilled specialist discipline within the broader marketing church, often confused for marketing. And I think that for me is a really, really important differentiation is like, I am delighted that I have the advertising element within my remit, because I think actually understanding what you're designing and why you're designing it and why you're building it enables you to communicate it better and more effectively and more clearly. And actually, I think we've probably all had the situation where we've been asked to create an advert or a campaign for something that you kind of go, but that's not really what people want. So that trying to actually not do that and then build things that people really want and need, then makes the job of advertising. You can actually make your advertising dollar go much further if you have a really, really clear and powerful proposition or solution or product.
We've spoken before as well about, I guess, the framing around the discussion around marketing leadership, and we talk a lot about marketing leadership, and actually, we spoke before about it's not just marketing leadership. When you're in a business, especially in these sort of C-suite marketing roles, customer roles, you're a leader. It's not just marketing leadership? Could you tell us a little bit around your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question. And actually, great. You're absolutely right. Great leadership is great leadership. Poor leadership is poor leadership, irrespective of what discipline or function that leadership is in. We talk quite a lot at HSBC about enterprise leadership, and I'm sure many others do in their organisations too. But really what we mean by that is looking beyond your function at how things might impact across the wider organisation, and always trying to take that sort of wider, more expansive view in the decisions that you make and the actions that you take. So I think that that's really, really important, that as your role grows and you take on a more senior leadership role, it isn't just about being really, really good at what you do. It's about being able to look out and across and join those dots, which I know I keep going on about. So I think that that's really, really critical. But I think more fundamentally, great leadership is actually, for me, it's all about building trust. I think it's very difficult to have great leadership if you don't have a sense of trust in the leader that you are working with or for. And I think it's also about clarity, capability and motivation. So as a leader, I see my role as being to create the environment in which people can feel safe, in which they feel that they can be at their best and they can thrive and grow and learn. But it's also about creating clarity. Why are we here? What are we doing? What is it that's important for the business? What's the business ambition? HSBC, we talk very, very clearly and frequently about our ambition to be the most trusted bank globally. We're putting customers at the heart of everything we do. So how are we making sure that we're living up to that ambition in everything that we do? But then what does that really mean materially for what my team does day in, day out? Because it's great to have a powerful ambition, but for a lot of people, you kind of go, yeah, I buy the ambition, but what does that mean for me right now? So the job of a leader is to help people to interpret that clearly. I think the other piece in that is about capability. So what are people able to actually, what do they do? What do they bring to the party? What are the innate skills that they bring? But also, what are the tools, the systems, the processes that we're wrapping around people to enable them to do the things that we are asking them to do? And then finally, one of the most critical bits is motivation. What's motivating people? How do you tap into their motivators to enable them to, sort of not put their head under the duvet again in the morning, but bounce out of bed and think, actually, I've got some really great things that I can do. And I know my contribution, I know it is valued, and I know how I make a difference. So I think for me, really great leadership is where I've seen trust built and created, both between the leader and the individual and then the leadership teams, but also where you can actually have real clarity, understand capability and understand what's motivating people within the team.
That's brilliant. There's so much in that to pick up. And I know we're sort of going to go on to talk about the marketing transformation work and I guess the team building stuff. But obviously you mentioned there around capability is a big factor, and I guess building capability, building skills, whether that's upskilling or the people you're hiring into a business. How has your approach in that respect sort of evolved, especially with the changed remit? Does that mean you've taken on, there's more people that you're speaking to day and more people sort of under your wings? I don't know if that's the right word.
I've got very long arms, but not that long.
So yeah, how has that sort of changed and grown from a capability perspective?
I think for me, a couple of things for me as a leader is the most recent element to come into my remit has been data and analytics. Now, I've always worked very closely with data, with analytics, looking for data signals. How do we understand that? But actually then really starting to understand some of the opportunities and challenges that we have. We're very fortunate in banks. Sometimes I think we underestimate this, just how much data we actually have access to. I always use the example with my team, in fact, when I was at Boots, is that Boots built the ad card because they didn't know who their customers were. Banks have never been in that situation. So it's a very different data dynamic in that sense. But I think actually really being curious about what you've got, what people are doing, what their day-to-day is, what makes life hard for them, but also what are some of the ambitions that they have that they perhaps haven't been able to fulfill that perhaps you can help unlock is really, really critical. But I think that curiosity about what is either within your remit or adjacent so that you can learn and understand and then make sure that you're not operating a silo is really, really key. I think the other bit for me is perhaps I'm a little bit odd about this is that I do genuinely encourage my teams to step outside of what they're doing and outside the team. But I have been very fortunate and have benefited enormously by stepping outside of financial services twice in my career. And I've also within financial services done some very, very different roles. So I do use experiences that I had from my spell at Boots quite regularly. I mean, Boots had a really phenomenal sort of understanding and had built really deep personas about customers, probably because they didn't have the luxury of lots and lots of data until they built out the ad card. So I'm going back a long time now. Boots is a very, very sophisticated data-driven business these days. But I think the other thing for me is I had when I first came to HSBC, I was actually running the current account P&L, so hundreds of millions of pounds worth of profit and loss account. And for me, having those different experiences when you're into a leadership role is really, really important, because it enables you to understand, what drives our business, how does that impact, if I change an interest rate here, what impact does that have on our overall balance sheet, on the shape and health of our business? What does that mean in terms of risk and regulatory risk and some of the things that we need to be thoughtful about? And I think if you stay very narrow, sometimes you aren't able to then understand those different permutations and the impacts that the actions might have. So I actively encourage people to step outside, step into different roles. I always hope that they want to come back, but I think it actually helps you to grow, to step into things that perhaps you might not think are directly associated with your ambition to be a marketing director, for example. So for me, it's really important. Equally, I think there are some amazing things that we're starting to see with the wider team that I've got, is that we've got a number of people doing things now, like the Mark Ritson's mini MBA, like the Marketing Academy, some amazing things that Marketing Society do. Many of those are people that would never call themselves marketers. But what we have encouraged people to do is go and learn and find out. And actually it really opens up their mind to go, marketing is a very, very broad church. Often people are doing elements of what you would call marketing without even knowing it. So I think that is also super, super helpful to say, how do you broaden your experience and actually understand the richness of marketing and the breadth of marketing, and bring some of those disciplines and tools and models into your day-to-day job.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. And there is that, like you mentioned, you've stepped out of financial services throughout your career. Was there an intentionality behind that at the time of doing it? I know careers are super personal and you take jobs for a million different reasons, but has there always been that intentionality there for you in shaping your career? Or I'm not trying to suggest you sort of just went with the flow of it either, but it'd be interesting to hear about that.
There was a real intention to experience something that wasn't financial services. So when I stepped out of financial services and into publishing, I deliberately wanted to not take my next role in financial services. I think at the time, the way I very ineloquently stated it was, I don't want to be carried out of a bank in a box. And my sense was that I was at a point in my career that if I took my next role within financial services, I probably would make it difficult for myself to step outside. I think actually, again, the world of work, that makes me sound very ancient, doesn't it? But that is different now to what it was even 10 years ago. So there is more flexibility, and there is more view on, there is more talk about transferable skills. I'm not always convinced that the talk turns into action. But I do think that if you can build a compelling story about the transferable skills that you have got to move from one industry to another, you can tell that story and you can demonstrate that you're worth taking a bet on.
Yeah, it's such a tough area. I think, like, I've written about, like I say, people struggling to make those moves, but I've also written articles about, how great it is to make those moves and why people should do it and the success stories certain people have had with it. But anytime we publish one of those stories, I'll get loads of people being like, well, this isn't what my experience is, and this isn't, and that's completely valid because it is so tough at the moment. But there's so many different sort of elements involved. What would you say to, I guess, a marketer? I mean, obviously you've just said everything you said here, but what would you say sort of, if someone's really wanting to do that and they're really struggling to make that move, where would you direct them? How would you sort of counsel them on that?
The first thing I would talk to them about is actually making a move within the organisation, or even more within the team that you are in. And I know that can be quite narrow and limiting, but actually there's always different things that you can do within team. So demonstrate that you are interested and willing to step sideways and do something different. And often building a very broad base of skill sets enables you to move up faster at a later point. So it's a classic go slower to go faster. But I would definitely counsel people to look at your current team and look at the opportunities to move across and around within your current team, to look at opportunities for projects, and may not necessarily be, I'm going to go and do that job, but can I volunteer into something? Can I build a development plan that says I want to actually practice this, and therefore get that on my line manager's radar, on their manager's radar, to actually go, actually, Molly's really interested in this, and Molly has got this as part of her development plan. So actually, when we're talking about somebody who wants to do this, why don't we actually see if Molly wants to do it? So don't be shy about your aspirations and your ambitions and what you want to learn. One of the things I always say is, I've not mastered many things, but I certainly haven't mastered mind reading. So things like having a very clear development plan are really important, and then talking about it. Again, looking at opportunities beyond your team, but within the organisation that you're in. I've done 3 very, very different roles within HSBC. I've been there 10 years in January, which has flown by, but I've 3 very, very distinct chapters. So again, and that opportunity is there if you go and look for it. So again, talk to people, talk to them about what you're interested in. When I moved out of running current accounts propositions for the UK bank and into a global marketing role, part of it was because I'd actually had a number of conversations with the then group CMO around something very specific but interesting into the UK, and we'd got to know each other. And she had a role available, and I was like, I'm not a marketer. Why would you want me to do that role? And she said, I've got lots and lots of people who are steeped in advertising and steeped in communications, and I want somebody who is more commercial. And so really interesting. So don't assume would be my final thing. Don't assume that what you are is not what people want.
That's brilliant. It reminds me of my uncle said to me a few years ago when I was just moaning about my life. And he was like,
we all do that, Molly, don't we?
He was like, quiet kids don't get sweets, or something like to that effect.
Yeah.
I was like, what do you mean? It's like, no, you need to ask. I'm like, that's the most straightforward, simple piece of advice, but completely changing as well. You sort of, when you think of it in that way, like, of course, you're not, your boss isn't going to be a mind reader.
They don't know. So tell them.
Definitely. And I know we touched on before about the marketing transformation and what's happened internally at HSBC. And when you spoke before about building communities of practice within teams and sort of how the teams work together and it not being siloed and breaking down sort of any of those barriers. Can you tell us a little bit about the shape of the HSBC's marketing team? I know there's a lot of people, so maybe not every single person in their role, but how you've got to this community of practice part and what that actually means for you.
So it is within the UK. We have a very integrated model in terms of customer marketing, communications, and so on. The biggest and most important bit for me in terms of building the customer team is to try and be clear on the why. And we are a work in progress. It's still, the team, my remit has expanded over the last 3 years, really, with the data and analytics piece being the most recent piece that's come in. But trying to help people to understand the why we are a customer team rather than a data and analytics team or a communications team or an advertising team is really important. And for me, it is around actually that we are uniquely placed to understand customers, build solutions, and tell them about it brilliantly. That we are uniquely placed, and we can do that in a very, very good flow. But the community of practice piece is actually it came about from me trying to make sense of the world that I'd got and go, how do I make this come together? How do I break down some of the silos? And really what I've tried to do is go, it's not a structure, it's trying to encourage a way of thinking. So what I've tried to do is go, actually, we have a data and analytics team and an customer insight team that were historically organisationally separate. They are still 2 separate teams within the customer world, but actually if they think of themselves as a community of practice, work together in terms of some of the briefs, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities around what do we understand about customers, so you get a much more rounded and holistic picture. You have then a sort of a marketing, communications and advertising type community of practice, which is all about how does our brand show up, how are we communicating, sort of in big set piece places, how are we bringing that through into the way that we are planning and spending our money, and how are we doing that in terms of the partnerships that we have and where we show up. Then we have a sort of a customer segment, community of practice, which is around actually, who are we for? Why do they want us? What is it that we're offering to them? How do we make that, work commercially? How are we optimizing that? And what are the challenges within that? And then we have a sort of a experience design and delivery sort of community of practice, which is, how do you make sure these things work? How do you get it done? How do you get it out there? How do you make sure that we're being a bank, that we are really, really managing our risks tightly and we're operating in control? So what I've tried to just do is go, instead of you being sort of 11 different teams, you're really 4 or 5 communities of practice, because there's a lot of similarity around what you do, and the power in the impact and what we can do is actually in bringing that together rather than operating within your silo. So it's an attempt to get everybody to just sort of look up and out a little bit and link up and go, actually, there's a whole lot more than the view of the world that I've got.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. And I was sort of thinking there about how people would react to that when they, like a new starter. And it's something I'm hearing about more and more, sort of people describe having like hubs or teams or like units operating in a certain way, which sounds very military. But that sort of is a growing focus, but not every business does this. And, they might be on a journey to, or, a little bit further behind where you're at with it. But how do people, new starters, how do they react to that? Is that, if people said that's completely different to their experience, or I can imagine a bit daunting because there's going to be so many people as well sort of working together.
It has to be around actually where can you go to find things is the way that, for me, it's about navigation and how do you link and navigate. So again, what you don't want to do is go, everybody has to be involved in absolutely everything. That's utterly unworkable and inefficient. But it is trying to go, what you're doing here has similarities with what you're doing here, and you're probably being asked very similar questions. So actually, if you join up and answer that question together, you'll give a much more 360 view in terms of the answer to the question. Or you'll actually look at it and go, that's possibly not the question you want to ask, because if you knew this, this, and this, you'd ask it in a different way. So that is really important. I think the most important thing is coming back to the what is the why? Why are we together as a customer team? It is a scale team. It is over 600 people onshore and offshore. So you can't know everybody. Certainly from my leadership perspective, I find it really uncomfortable that I don't know everybody personally in my team, because most of my career I've known everybody in my team personally, and I find that really difficult as a leader. It's something I have to sort of learn and relearn about. How do I get comfortable with that? Because you can't possibly, but also how do I create the environment for everybody to feel that they can be them, that be at their best. So that why is, why are we doing it? Why is it important that you connect? And what are the outcomes for customers that we are all aligned behind to deliver that will also drive our commercial performance? So what is your contribution, and who can help you make that contribution even more impactful?
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I mean, it's interesting that you admit around having, the nature of having such a big team and not being able to, hold everyone's hand sort of physically, But I guess then from that, it sort of drills down the importance of, within those teams, the leaders that you have working sort of, I hate the phrasing working underneath you, but sort of the people who, report into you, who are sort of managing those teams, and their connections across the business too, I imagine is obviously super important as well when there's so many people.
Yes, it is. It's absolutely critical, and I think that's something in any organisation, large or small, that clarity piece around, why are you doing it? What's the outcomes that you're gunning for? Why is that important? Who are you for? Why you want that is really, really important. And again, looking across my leadership team, I'm very fortunate to have some phenomenal leaders within that very, very diverse group of people with very, very different skill sets. From sort of somebody who's working in advertising to somebody who's sort of like a data scientist. They're very, very different human typologies, but that's actually really rich. And I would say one of the things that really excites me at the moment is that we had a day together only a couple of weeks ago, and when you look at the way that we now scatter, or how we don't scatter, but actually how we sit around different drivers and motivators and capabilities as a team, it's genuinely one of the most rounded teams that I have ever been fortunate enough to work in or lead. So we have, strong reds through to really strong yellows, really strong blues and greens in terms of some of the sort of like the sort of like behaviours that you see. And I have not worked in a team that balanced for ever. So again, the breadth of a customer team then goes, actually, the dynamic here is really interesting, because we can if we can create the right environment around trust and care and clarity, we can really do some amazing things.
Definitely. What colour are you, if you don't mind me asking? It's too personal a question.
Red, yellow.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of
lots of
makes sense
marketers
in a good way.
are.
Yeah, at Marketing we write a lot about the future of marketing and what the future marketer looks like. And I wanted to ask you about that. I feel like maybe from what you've said already, I've got a sense of what that might be. Or
I think it's a great question, because we're all working through, what does AI mean for marketing? What does, it's one of those really sort of strange things, is that marketing is actually being defined by technology as much, if not more, than most most sort of practices actually at the moment. So we I think the future marketer is actually like the future most things is somebody that has to be adaptable, resilient, be able to join those dots, think creatively. And I very deliberately say think creatively. It's not necessarily about being creative. I don't think of myself creative. I think probably because my art teacher told my parents, do not let her do art at GCSE. She's so incompetent. So I've always thought I'm not creative. But I think thinking creatively about problems is really, really important. And I think the other bit for me is being able to really read data and data signals rapidly and turn that into action. So I think there are lots of being technically literate, being commercially literate. Marketing's a tough gig because you have to be good at lots of things. And if you're not, then there's somebody who's an expert who goes, well, you haven't done that commercially well enough, or you haven't done this, that, and the other. So it's a tough gig to be. And I think I think it'll be tough in the future for marketers. But there's also a number of things that marketers tend to have as superpowers, which is that ability to think creatively, to join dots, that I think sets marketers up to be actually really great leaders in the future as well.
Yeah, I think it's so important. Again, like you're saying there, I don't know if maybe it's just in this industry, but I don't know if any other industry is so quick to be so critical of their peers in a certain way, and the pressure and the sort of like almost echo chamber nature of it sometimes. But I feel that's opening another kind of work. So we're about to
that's a different podcast.
But I think the last question for you, Becky, is what are you excited for? Obviously, you've gone through this like transformation period at HSBC. The team's changed, your roles changed. Hate to end on what's next, but what does that look like in the next 12 months?
Well, I think HSBC we're at a very exciting point as a business. We are going through a serious amount of transformation, but I think the clarity around what we are and who we're for is clearer than it has ever been. And I touched on it before around our ambition to be the most trusted bank globally, putting customers at the heart of everything we do. We haven't had that level of clarity around ambition. And then the strategy that sits underneath that is very, very clear. We talk constantly about, we need to be more customer focused, we need to be simple and agile, and we need to grow. That's quite straightforward. There's lots sitting underneath that. But I think I'm very excited about what an organisation of the scale of HSBC can do when we have that leadership clarity and that strategic clarity. So that's very exciting. I'm hugely excited. Quick plug that HSBC this week has been announced as the most valuable brand in the UK. So that's just such a huge lift for us as an organisation and demonstrates the progress that HSBC has made over the last few years, and makes us all very, very proud. So I think we're in a really strong place. Transformation and change isn't without its challenges, but I think change is inevitable and is constant. So I'm very excited about what can come next, and I think the focus that we have is really, really exciting.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Becky, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you for having me.